All I had as a child was Mom and me. More than anything else, Dad's abandonment when I was a little child is a fading memory. Mom put in a lot of overtime, taking on multiple jobs to support us and make sure I could concentrate on my education. Her sacrifices allowed me to secure a grant that allowed me to complete my undergraduate education without acquiring the massive debt that is now typical. Driven by a combination of desire and dread that we would ever be as poor as we were when I was a child, I studied business management. I moved to the city and packed up my life after graduating. Living in a small apartment and eating ramen more often than I'd care to admit was a difficult beginning. But I managed to get a job at a big corporation, working my way up from a junior position. After a few years, I was in charge of an entire department instead of just working there. It was my territory, not just a job, and I made sure everyone I worked with understood how important they were. I would tell the newcomers during training, "You got to lead with respect. Treat this job like you own it, and soon enough you won't just be part of the team, you'll be leading it." They had a good group of people on the team. We went to the neighborhood restaurants to celebrate my acceptance as the department head. It was just a warm, welcoming spot with plenty of laughter and cold beer. Nothing fancy. Here's to Allison, the superior lady. One of my oldest co-workers, Daniel, lifted his glass high. The sound of glasses clinking rose above the din of the bar as the others joined in. Many thanks, everyone. All of us are involved in this. Cheers to taking names and kicking more ass. To my cry over the din, the squad responded with a roar of approval. Amid the cheers and backslaps that evening, I saw him. Jasper saw my attention and strolled closer, flashing a smile that could throw you off guard. Couldn't help but take note of the excitement. "What is the event?" He leaned on the bar and asked. "A tiny career boost, please. Now that I'm the leader of my department." I tried not to sound too cocky. "That is quite remarkable. It must be a difficult job," he responded, nodding in gratitude. "It's Jasper, by the way." "Allison, it's nice to meet you." That night, our conversation became more serious than I had expected. It found that Jasper was a financier with the same level of familiarity with mathematics as I had with project designs. Weekends spent together replaced the initial informal dates throughout the course of the following 6 months. I soon found myself spending more time at his house than mine. His place was amazing. It had high ceilings, a view to talk about, and a coziness that my bland rental couldn't equal. One evening, as we sat on his balcony taking in the city lights, Jasper turned to face me, with a serious expression covering his usually light-hearted features. I could feel the tense tension vibrating through my hands as he took them in his. "These past few months spent with you, Allison, have been the happiest of my life. Although this may seem quick, you just know when you know, don't you?" He began, a hint of assurance mixed with hope in his voice. I nodded, feeling my heart begin to rush as the city began to fade. From under his jacket, he produced a little box that he opened to display a ring that glinted almost as much as his eyes. It caught the light just right. "Will you marry me, Allison?" I managed to say, "Yes, Jasper, totally yes," in a voice filled with emotion. In an instant, I became engaged to a man who truly saw me and cherished every aspect of me, even the ones with nails for toughness. My stomach was in knots the day I was supposed to meet Jasper's parents. It dawned on me when Jasper took us to a vast estate with a driveway that surpassed the length of my apartment building. These people weren't simply wealthy, they were extremely well off. I felt the place's weight as soon as I got out of the car. The house, all brick and ivy, with dragons peering down from above as if they sensed I didn't belong. It looked like something from an old British film. Squeezing my hand, Jasper led me to the enormous oak doors. He said, "You'll be fine, Allison." But it seemed more like he was trying to convince himself of that as well. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were there when the door opened. Her clothing was something out of a magazine, and his suit was probably more expensive than my rent. The large foyer featured a chandelier that glistened above, resembling a constellation. There were portraits of serious-looking people on the walls with titles like Sir and Lady. "Allison, it's great to see you at last. My name is Charles, and this is Maria, my wife," Mr. Wilson remarked, his cool, silky voice tinged with a little rehearsed English accent. Mrs. Wilson smiled at me, but it didn't get to her eyes. Once we entered the dining room, I managed to say, "Pleasure to meet you both," while attempting to maintain my composure. Jasper gave me some fast pointers on what to do with each fork, but his words were jumbled in my mind. When dinner was served, the atmosphere was so judgmental that it seemed like you were sitting in a freezer. Mr. Wilson gestured to a picture of a bearded, stern-looking man. "That's Sir Reginald Wilson, a direct ancestor from England who came over in the 1800s to establish our family here," he proudly stated. I tried to seem excited as I added, "Really impressive." But it was difficult to eat when every motion felt like it was being scrutinized. I mistakenly grabbed for the salad fork, but the hush that followed let me know that I had made a mistake. I looked to Jasper for assistance, but Mrs. Wilson's voice interrupted him before he could say anything in a whisper. She continued, cutting to the point with every syllable. "Perhaps things are done otherwise where you come from, dear." My cheeks were burning hot as I murmured, "Sorry, still getting the hang of all this." Jasper attempted to diffuse the situation by telling his parents a story about us, but they were more interested in seeing me fumble with the dessert spoon. With every meal, their looks made me feel smaller and heavier. We all strolled into the Wilsons' large living room after the cold dinner. More stuffy than the dining hall, the space felt much more enclosed by the thick curtains and luxurious rugs. I felt like an exhibit in a museum about common people as I collapsed into one of the elaborate seats. Mrs. Wilson leaned forward and sat neatly on the edge of her seat. "Allison, please share more about your loved ones with us. Your childhood must have been very dissimilar from ours." I felt Jasper's stiff stare as I paused. "It was just my mother and me. My father departed when I was very small, and I have few memories of him. Mom took all the necessary steps to raise me alone. She works as a nurse." The room became eerily quiet. With a start, Mrs. Wilson stood up, her chair making a screech against the wooden floor. She uttered, "This is unacceptable," with a tone full of distaste. "Our ancestors came from an old English family. We follow customs and norms. My only son cannot and will not be allowed to wed someone who has no family history or knowledge of her own." At last, Mr. Wilson, who had been listening to the discussion in silence, said something. His sentences fell one after the other like a weight. "We need our family relationships to be solid and well established. Allison, are your great-grandparents even named?" My face began to flush, shame slowly eating away at me. "My knowledge of my grandparents is limited to my mother's side," I admitted, speaking just barely audibly. Mr. Wilson gave a disdainful roll of his eyes. "This is precisely what we were afraid of," he said in a low voice. At last, Jasper spoke up, sounding firm but imploring. "Please, Mom and Dad, Allison loves me, is honest, and is kind. Isn't that what ought to be important?" His mother had a cold, hard stare. "What counts, Jasper, is deference to our family's norms and respect. Allison has to pick up our ways if she wants to be a part of this family. Even if her perspective is insignificant, she should nevertheless show respect for it." Their words cut through the nice sensations from earlier in the evening, leaving a stinging impression. However, Jasper was staring at me and pleading with me to simply accept it. Reluctantly, I nodded to accept their conditions. "All right," I responded, attempting to maintain my composure. "I'll learn about your immediate family and your customs." My compromise seemed to appease Mrs. Wilson to some extent. All right. To begin, you will need to become acquainted with our family tree and learn the identities of each individual in those photographs. Allison, it's not just about names. Respect for our ancestry is at issue. A part of me shrank away as they talked more about their aspirations. It had become a trial by fire instead of just a meet and greet that evening. Yes, I had complied with their requests, but at what price? I couldn't help but feel removed from these people and, strangely enough, from the parts of Jasper that were so closely linked to them as the room filled with talk of forebears and heroic adventures. The weeks that followed that formal dinner flew by. Between doing my day job and taking all the etiquette and style classes that Mr. and Mrs. Wilson insisted I take, I hardly had time to breathe. I felt like a zombie when my day came to an end long after the sun had set, beginning with the buzz of an alarm clock just before sunrise. During one of our lessons, the etiquette instructor gently reprimanded Allison, saying, "Elbows off the table, and remember, the soup spoon moves away from you when you scoop." I nodded, trying to mimic her gestures, but my thoughts were focused on other things, such as the never-ending wedding planning and the pile of work that awaited me back at the office. "You're doing great," she comforted in a calming voice. "These things take time to become second nature." I smiled a little at her. "Thanks, it's a lot, you know." Like clockwork, my phone rang. Mom was there. I excused myself and went outside to answer the call, feeling around for a quiet spot in the busy metropolis as I pressed the phone to my ear. I said, "Hi, Mom," sounding more worn out than I meant to. "Allison, sweetheart, how are the wedding arrangements going?" With a trace of fear mixed with enthusiasm, she questioned. I paused so as not to frighten her. "Everything is well." Trying to keep my tone light, I responded, "I've learned a lot, even how to waltz." She paused, and I could tell she wasn't quite sure. "Honey, you sound so worn out. Are you sleeping enough? It shouldn't be this difficult, you know. You must look after your own needs." I gave a feeble laugh. "I'll give it my best, Mom. But right now, there's a lot to juggle, including job, dancing lessons, etiquette classes, and wedding plans. Remember, Allison, what matters most. In the end, it's just you and Jasper, not all these guidelines and lessons." Although her comments were comforting, reality returned to pound on me as soon as we hung up. I felt like I had to choose between keeping my sanity and appeasing Jasper's parents. It felt like there was no finish line in sight to every marathon of a day. I went back inside and started my training again, the instructor's voice a constant drone in the background as I rehearsed holding a wine glass the right way. Pinch the stem, not the bowl, apparently. When I did have any downtime, I would frequently find myself staring at the ceiling and questioning if it was all worth it. The never-ending classes, the unwavering surveillance, and the chilly eyes from Mr. and Mrs. Wilson when I made a mistake, which happened more often than I would like to admit. My phone buzzed just as I was going to fall asleep one evening. Jasper appeared, his message illuminating the screen. "How was your day? I miss you." With my fingers lingering over the keyboard, I gazed at the message. I wanted to tell him everything, to let all of my worries and emotions come out, but I refrained. Rather, I just typed, "Miss you too. Good day following a long day." I put the phone down and was immediately struck by how quiet my apartment was. Was this the way things would work out? Smiling under pressure and pushing through tiredness in order to fit in with a world that was becoming more and more foreign to me. It was finally the big day. The event space was a whirlwind of flowers, elegant gowns, and the faces of the city's elite passing by. I stood in my long, flowing white dress, struggling to catch my breath, my stomach in knots. My mother approached, twitching a loose curl on my forehead. "Allison, everything will be fine," she smiled gently to reassure me. I wanted to believe her, but any expectation of a calm wedding vanished as soon as the ceremony started. Jasper's parents had an obsession with being right. With a hint of arrogance, Mr. Wilson welcomed guests, and Mrs. Wilson was happy to tell anyone who would listen how they were responsible for making it all possible. I felt the weight of the day bearing down on me as the visitors got comfortable. The reception was an additional challenge, but the ceremony itself was a flurry of rings and vows. Under the constant supervision of Jasper's parents, I skillfully negotiated discussions with his extended family and friends. Every action I took felt closely watched, every word examined. Jasper drew me aside at the reception, his eyes scanning mine. "Are you okay?" he said, his face showing signs of worry. I feigned a laugh. "Yes, I'm a little overwhelmed." He squeezed my hand. "With each other, we'll overcome this." I hoped he was correct as I nodded. As the night went on, I started to feel the strain of the expectations. However, glancing at Jasper, I realized I needed to figure out a way to make it work. We had this future ahead of us, and I had to cling to the love that got us here, even if it meant wending our way through the complicated web of his family's expectations. I made an effort to socialize, but Mrs. Wilson drew me in with a cold smile. "Allison, please see to it that our friends are looked after. Go fetch some drinks, there's a good girl," she said, pointing angrily at some old men who were loudly debating politics. But I started, but her sharp gaze interrupted me. "Without a but. You guys are like family now. Take some responsibility, please," she yelled. I reluctantly moved platters of hors d'oeuvres and champagne from table to table, my dress falling behind. I felt less like a bride and more like a servant because of the weight of the fabric and the duty. I saw bits of Jasper laughing and chattering along, completely unaware of my situation. While serving another round of drinks, I heard Mrs. Wilson's voice break through the din. "Tonight, Allison will be serving us. Isn't it wise for her to practice this?" Her eyes darted throughout the throng, seeking approval with a disdainful tone. The final straw was that. I walked up to her, my voice steady, but my hands trembling a little. "At my own wedding, I'm not serving food. This is what the employees that work here are meant to do." With a faux surprised expression, Mrs. Wilson rose. "We should be happy that we welcomed such a straightforward girl into our family." With words sharp as knives, she growled, "Remember your place, Allison." Anger started to swell in my cheeks. I shot back, speaking a bit loudly than I meant to. "This is my wedding, not a performance for your friends?" The room quieted down with all eyes focused on us. At the end of our conversation, Jasper staggered over holding a glass of champagne. His eyes were a little off focus, and he stumbled slightly, asking, "What's going on here?" "Jasper, your mother is behaving like a servant to me at our wedding. This isn't the purpose of the day," I exclaimed, losing all patience. Jasper's expression darkened as he glanced between his mother and me. "Why are you creating such a fuss, Allison? Do as my mother says. It's not that significant." "Not much of an issue, Jasper. Your mother is destroying our day, and it's ours," I fired back, hurt mixed with incredulity. Before he spoke, he took a long swallow of his champagne. "You need to be pleased that I ever considered you, Allison. There were lots of girls beautiful and wealthier than you. You are fussing over nothing at all." The words felt like a real smack to the face. I drew back, the knowledge sinking in. We weren't partners to the man I loved and was about to marry. I was just an extra piece of jewelry to him, something to shape into the ideal version of himself that his parents desired. My mother approached while I was gripping my bouquet even more tightly, afraid that I may break right then. After glancing at me, she embraced me with an embrace that seemed to keep everything else out. "Do you love this man, honey? Are you truly planning to wed him?" She spoke in a worried-sounding whisper. Barely able to get the words out, I shook my head. "No, Mother. This is beyond me. I have no desire to." Mom gave a nod, her jaw clenching into that determined expression I was all too familiar with. Her touch was comforting as she took the bouquet from my hands and led me to a chair. Then, with unexpected energy, she went up to the DJ, requested the microphone, and turned to face the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your focus, please?" With a steady, clear voice, my mother attracted everyone's attention in the room by breaking through the whispers. A silence, like that which comes before a storm, fell. She inhaled deeply and looked straight at Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Maintaining a steady stare, she said, "I have something important to share about truth and pretense. Eleanor Wilson and Charles Wilson attended the same school as me. They didn't boast of noble heritage back then, or speak with an English accent. Like our family, theirs was a hard-working one." A whisper shook the assembly. "Maria's mother worked as a waitress at the neighborhood diner, and Charles's father was a mechanic," she said, her words resonating strongly. She took a moment to ponder the ramifications. The portraits, the accents, the surname, they bought them all to craft a past that would hide where they really came from. Whispers broke out throughout the room, and everyone turned to look at the Wilsons with a mixture of horror and incredulity on their faces. Mrs. Wilson rose to her feet, the aristocratic facade dissolving as her cheeks turned scarlet. "That's ridiculous." My mother, though, wasn't done. "To think that you would despise my kid and assess her deservingness by standing on these lies is absurd. 1,000 of your fake titles are not worth Allison. You have long since forgotten how to be real, but she is." Now that they were staring at the Wilsons, the guests were openly muttering, their fascinated expressions changing to ones of contempt. With a more desperate and less sophisticated accent, Mr. Wilson attempted to speak. "We did what we thought was best for—" But my mother interrupted, her voice ferocious. "For your child? For the community? Or simply because of self-centered pride?" Everyone's attention had been pulled to the confrontation, and now there was a buzz in the room, an air of tension and revelations. The Wilsons appeared to recede, their majesty vanishing into thin air, leaving just the harsh reality of their beginnings. As he charged at me, Jasper's expression twisted into a mixture of disbelief and rage. With a barely audible hiss, he leaned forward and said, "Allison, you've ruined everything. After this spectacle, you've embarrassed my family, and now you're asking me if I want to marry you." His comments cut deep, but before I could reply, he pulled me in by grabbing my arm. His threat, "I'll teach you how to be a good wife, one who knows her place and obeys," hung chillingly in the air. With all my strength, I withdrew my arm and moved away from him. With everyone's eyes fixed on us, the room fell silently. I was supposed to marry this man. I was going to become a member of this family. No, I couldn't live like this. I inhaled deeply, feeling the strength from before coming back through me. I pronounced, "There will be no wedding," clearly enough for all the guests to hear. I regret that I ever considered marrying someone who truly matches the arrogance and deceit of his parents. There were murmurs across the room, some of shock, some of support. With his mouth wide open, Jasper appeared to be attempting to grasp the words and reinsert them into my mouth. My mom arrived at my side, her presence a reassuring barrier against the mayhem. Heads held high, we made our way through the throng together. The city was informed of the Wilsons' shame in the weeks that followed. Their fictitious ancestry and elevated social status vanished quickly, much like a house of cards. Former admirers now walked across the street to avoid their embarrassment. In an attempt to move on and start over somewhere their history wouldn't haunt them, they sold their mansion. I had heard some gossip about Jasper's downward slide and his attempts to drink his way out of embarrassing situations. Sincerely, I didn't care to find out, and I wasn't sure if they were true. I had no desire to turn back now that he had shown me his true, dark, and twisted colors. I said, "Thank you, Mom," in our small living room one evening. In comparison to the lavish facade I nearly married into, it was quite different. "Thank you for everything, for being there, for standing up for me, and for letting me see the truth before it was too late." She grasped my hand and gave it a light squeeze. "Allison, I'll stay here forever. Since you are my daughter, I have raised you to be dependable and powerful. No family or man can ever take away from your identity." We sat there in a soothing familiarity as the TV hummed in the background. I had lost my fiancé, but I had also won back my life, my dignity, and, most importantly, my prospects. After the disastrous wedding, going back to work seemed like entering a place of safety. My coworkers were quite supportive after learning about the chaos. Daniel exclaimed, "Allison, you saved yourself a bullet, girl," as soon as I entered the office. With a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, he leaned on my desk, maybe as a welcome-back gift or a peace offering. "Many thanks, Daniel. It's nice to be back," I answered, sipping the coffee and savoring its comforting, strong warmth. Jenny added, "And yeah, that bullet was more like a cannonball," as she leaned over her cubicle. "You're not a suitable husband for someone who makes you serve guests at your own wedding. You deserve so much more, sweetie." I grinned, appreciative of our friendship. "I agree as well. It's good to be back in an environment where people value my work rather than the family I may have married into." My team's support did not waver as the days stretched into weeks. I met Brian, a buddy of a friend, during this period of recovery. He was a simple person with an appealing smile and laid-back attitude. There was nothing spectacular about his background. On a Saturday afternoon, we got together in a small, informal get-together. When I went in, there he was, giggling at something ridiculous. "Hey, you must be Allison," Brian said, standing up to greet me. "I've heard a lot about you. All good things, I promise." "Thanks, Brian. I hope they didn't spread too much," I replied, trying to match his easy attitude. We hit it off instantly. His family was the polar opposite of the harsh Groves. The first time I met his parents, they welcomed me with warm hugs and genuine smiles. "Allison, we're just glad Brian found someone who makes him so happy," his mom said, pulling me into a hug as soon as I stepped through their front door. It was refreshing, the simplicity of it all. No showing off, no demands, just mutual respect and acceptance. We were taking our time, neither of us rushing to get to know each other better than just friends. One day, I was called into my boss's office at work. "Allison, let me just say that everyone has observed the way you've handled everything. Even though it hasn't been simple, you have maintained a high standard of performance." Unsure of where this was going, I nodded. "We believe that a new promotion is warranted. You've shown that you're capable of managing most situations, and your leadership has never failed." I felt a wave of pride as I left his office. I had a new relationship blossoming. My career was taking off, and I had the respect of people who mattered to me. At last, I felt like I belonged somewhere.